So we got to talking now about the rigidity and bias in our education system, and particularly the overriding influence at the moment under the present system of economics and political concerns. So both Ikeda and Toynbee discussed this at length, and they come up with three possible solutions. I don't want to dwell on them. That's something that is technical and not my particular concern in these lectures. But one of them would be an incredible reform, which would be to make education separate under the Constitution, like the judiciary are separate. That is to say, they would be absolutely, in that sense, autonomous. The other way would be to make all schools self-supporting by some system of subsidies and endowments. And the third way, that there should be an independent, totally independent body, independent of all political influences, which controls grants, and some way in which the total funds for those grants are equally independent. So these are only ideas which they just throw out to discuss. But my point in just even mentioning that is, who in NSUK is going to bring this big change about? Of course, we've got a very thriving education group. We were the first country outside of Japan in the whole world to establish an education group through Robert's initiative. What year, Robert?
77, I think, 78.
1978. So that wasn't for no reason at all. Why should we have been so prominent and so advanced compared with other countries in concerning ourselves with education, and indeed in the desire of the teachers to get together and really seriously discuss how to apply Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism to their own work as teachers, but also to the education system as a whole. As you know now, they have started to hold, it's only still the very beginnings, worldwide representatives conferences at the time of the SGI festival in Japan. There'll be another one this year in October. So gradually SGI is getting into grips the world over, because education is so crucially important, isn't it? So certainly somewhere in the future it'll really need the wisdom of the Gohonzon. This is my point, and it's the point really of all these subjects that we consider in the New Century Group. It'll need the wisdom of the Gohonzon to find the way to carry out these really important, crucial reforms. And of course, because they're crucially important in terms of value, in terms of human happiness, there will be immense negative resistance. So it's going to need people who are basing their lives on the Gohonzon to maintain the consistent effort, maybe over a whole lifetime, to win this battle. How to overcome these many, I just mentioned one reform. It's a very crucial one. How to release education from the economy and politics. But there are many, many other aspects, even of that one subject. And definitely in the future, there will be people in NSUK who play a leading role in this. So this brings back to mind, doesn't it, the whole concept of Kosen Rufu, which is so exciting. We may assemble here in the New Century Group, or in our headquarters, or we go to study meetings and discussion meetings, but each of us has our own individual function in a social sense, and indeed in a political sense. So each of us in our own particular field can change people's views, can introduce a new dimension of looking at problems, because we're basing our actions, our thinking on the Causton. That's the point. So none of us can escape from that. And probably many of us may even now be beginning to cause people to think differently, almost without realizing it. Because the truth is, isn't it, that once you practice to the Causton, your way of looking at things is naturally changing anyway. And therefore the way you talk in a conversation over a cup of coffee may be very different from everybody else. But that is the way of Causton Rufu. That is the way social change is brought about. Each person in their own particular sphere of action. Like a pebble, dropped in the pond. New ideas, new way of looking at things and spreading out to lots of other people. So I really have great hopes that in the New Century group, by the end of the whole thing, there'll be 250 of us. Somewhere there's someone who is going to play a major role in changing the views of people in terms of education, which happens to be our subject today, and all the other subjects that we discuss. So, whatever education is produced in the future, one thing is for sure, is that its basic principle has to be, doesn't it, the supreme dignity of life. If people can get that straight, everything will go straight. The supreme dignity of life, and each individual life, each individual person who has to be educated in that system. So through that, keeping that principle as fundamental, then of course, with the power of the Causton, we can begin to unravel ways and means to achieve that. But it involves a whole process of changing people's ways of thinking. When he was in Paris, Sensei said he wanted members, the French members he was talking to, he wanted the French members to be like lighthouses. In other words, because of their faith and practice, people were attracted to them, attracted to their ideas, like birds are attracted to a lighthouse. Or equally, through listening to the words and observing the actions of those who are practicing, people can also learn to avoid the rocks and shoals, which is the main function of the lighthouse. This gradually we all find ourselves doing. But I think it's important to be clear that we have that function ahead. Our life is important. There's not one of you in this room whose life is not important. There's not actually one single member of SGI-UK whose life is not important. Because whatever he or she may be doing in society, he or she are basing every action and word on the Causton. So it's an amazing movement, isn't it? Unprecedented, extraordinary, brilliant when you see it put together, as it were, for a moment. For example, in a thing like Alice. By the way, today is the first anniversary of the first performance of Alice. So of course we have to think of ways and means of making the teachers' lives better, more rewarding. Now it's not just rewarding in terms of money. It's rewarding in terms of developing themselves. The possibility of them having sabbaticals when they can really challenge some particular subject which they feel they need to master themselves, or to brush up and broaden their perhaps rather specialist view and be able to take in a much broader view of the influences that are brought to bear on that particular specialist view. Specialists are sunk in a ditch. They become separated from everything that's going on around them. Interestingly enough, what is the aim of CHEC, the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council? Nothing else but to make the specialists, to make them, in one way or another, actually listen to, see the actions of other specialists who may all in the end be working towards the same goal, which is to build, for example, a happy inner city. Up to now, the specialists, each in their own turn, are doing their little bit, never looking over the top of their ditch, not considering also the people who live there, maybe, often, and so on. So specialization is incredible danger. It's arisen out of technology, out of the complexity of learning technological sciences and processes. And it's got a grip on the whole of our education system in this country. You don't get great big minds anymore, as I said earlier. But our minds, if we like to make it so, can become great and big. We're specialists in life, not just in some narrow area of life, but in life as a whole, aren't we? So learning, we'll come back to that now. We have to learn at our own pace, in accordance with our own rhythm of life. I think this is very important. Learning, although you have to make effort to learn, it has to be an enjoyable process. You have to make the effort, but it should be enjoyable, therefore it should fit in with one's rhythm of life. So Sensei still, as I think I mentioned the other day, reads hugely. That's his main source of learning still. Books, books, books. He doesn't read them all through from beginning to end. He sees, first of all, if for his life they're worth reading. If there may be something new he can learn from it. So he does that probably by glancing through them, or just reading the conclusions. I don't know how he does it. Others he'll read from cover to cover. You can be selective. Certainly Mr. Toda, really trained him by making him read the great classics, because one can learn so much from them. I had some strange disease like measles or something or other. I can't remember, but I was about 13 and I read War and Peace for the first time then. Is that surprising?
13.
Yeah. I never thought twice about it. I wasn't an intellectual person, I can assure you, not a bit. I don't know, it was in my grandfather's bookcase, I think, and I just took it out. But I really got a hell of a lot from it. It completely absorbed me. I think it took the whole of that illness to get through it. But if you haven't read it, well, then that's a great book to begin with. War and Peace. It's an incredible book. You learn so much from it. Or if you don't like that sort of thing, there are other books. Great books. Books that really can teach you something. Of course, when I was young, there was no TV. This was very valuable. Most of us in my family read. Most evenings, not every evening, but most evenings everyone was reading something. It was really nice. Then everyone would put their books down and we'd have a talk or discussion amongst the family. Really incredibly good sort of life, I think, looking back on it, compared to this way we have to do it today, all sitting in one direction. It was really human. I wish we could get back to it. I think people will, and I think people are, in fact. people are becoming selective now, feeling they want to read instead of being glued to the box all evening. And I'm not condemning what's on the box. I mean, I think there's wonderful stuff on it quite often. But it shouldn't be for always. So, after I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot about myself, aren't I? But after that period when I was young, around again it was about that period of 12 to 15, then I got caught up with life, with girlfriends, with the war, and I really didn't read much at all for years and years, until I began to worry about my life when I was about 30. And then I began to read again. And at that time I really tackled things that I'd not tackled before. Books about religion, books about philosophy, life, history, biographies, those sort of things. And again, the rhythm of my life suited it, because I had to commute between London and East Sussex, where we were living at the time. So there was a lot of time on the train. And I really made use of it, and looking back over it, it was the most wonderful 3 or 4 years of travelling on that train and reading every day, gaining so much enjoyment from it. But whatever happens, that's the way to learn. And Sensei is really extraordinary. When I receive, the great poem which he's written for each of 4 countries, including us, you'll see it before too long. But I was amazed at his knowledge of British history. And first of all, he mentioned, the reason I was cornered by this was that the translators, thought that I would know, Mr. Causton would know all about everything too, and Mr. Causton didn't. That they were trying to translate, you see, and they rang me up. The first question was, can you tell us about the revolution of 1688, you see? And I thought, 1688? That certainly wasn't Cromwell's time. And the next revolution I could think of was Bonnie Prince Charlie, and I wasn't too sure about him. But anyway, of course, it was William of Orange. I did get it in the end, but it took me, I had to say, I'll bring you back. And it took me a bit of time before I could do that. And even then, I rang later, I think it was the next day, we rang London to make them check up and make sure. But it was called the Glorious Revolution, because there was no bloodshed. It was a bloodless revolution, and that was why Sensei mentioned it in this poem. Because he was saying that it's innate in the characteristics of the British people to be able to achieve such things if they really set their minds to it. And then they rang me up and said, oh, there's a saying here, it reads as follows: reason lies between the spur and the reins. And Mr. Causton, this is a British or an English proverb, so we know you must know it. And of course, I had no idea; I'd never heard it before. Anyway, that completely stumped me. Reason lies between the spur, things on the back of your boots, and the reins. Oh, it sounded good sense to me. Anyway, I didn't know. I'd never heard that proverb before. And so we ran up Richmond, and Indra Adman luckily was there, and she rushed off to the library and came back triumphant. Was it Indra who did it, I think? Or was it you, Robert? No, it was Indra, I think. Anyway, she came back triumphant. There was just one word wrong. The actual proverb is, reason lies between the spur and the bridle. In other words, reason lies between the decision to accelerate or advance, if you like, and the decision to hold back and take it steady. Very interesting. But I'd never heard it before, and obviously none of you had. Had anyone here heard it? Oh, well done. Really? When you were young, or when?
Yes, when I was just a horseman, so...
That's interesting. Great. Well, I'm glad to hear you've heard it, anyway. At least one person in NSUK. But it's extraordinary. I mean, since he was writing these poems, actually there in Paris, and he had no means of referring back to anything. So it's amazing, the knowledge that he has inside him. So, I beg you, read. I know I've mentioned it before to you. Read. And read good books. Not all at once, don't make it indigestible, but read. Allow time for reading. Somehow. Oh, how can I do that, one says. How can I possibly allow time for reading? But my answer to that is you can. If you really want to do it, you can. Like anything else, nothing's impossible. And it's vitally important to us all. So, the authors from there talk a bit about intellectuals and the people. And I'll ask Robert to read a little passage from page 75.
This is Professor Toynbee again. In my field, which is historical research, the most eminent historians have not been part-time teachers. They have been part-time politicians, administrators, soldiers or businessmen. Some of them have carried on their two professions simultaneously. Others have retired voluntarily or compulsorily from some practical profession part way through their working life and have then taken to writing history. They have succeeded in writing admirable historical works because they've been able to draw on their own first-hand experience. They have taken part themselves in activities of the kind that they have subsequently studied, and this has given them insight and wisdom.
I thought that was really fascinating, that the great historians haven't been historians from beginning to end of their lives, and that they were basically men of action. In other words, again, they were not specialists. They were people who had had a broad experience and understanding of life, and through that were able to view history and take it in its whole rather than in narrow bits and pieces. So this is mentioned because they're talking about the situation of the intellectual, and they both reach the conclusion and agree that there should be no separation between intellectuals and the ordinary people. There shouldn't be a classification, an intellectual, that everyone actually is an intellectual in their own particular field of interest. So interestingly, of course, in the Lotus Sutra, it refers to the men of two vehicles, right? That's the men of learning and the men of partial enlightenment. And of course, before the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni said these big-headed people, these conceited people with conceited minds will never attain Buddhahood. And it wasn't until he preached the Lotus Sutra that he said they would be able to become Buddhists. But he also, of course, in the Lotus Sutra said that these teachings would only come into their own 2,000 years after he died. So, in the Ongi Kuden, the oral teachings of Nichiren Daishonin makes it plain that everybody today in this world that we live in now are in fact people of the two vehicles, people of learning and partial enlightenment. We all are, because of the way the intellectual capacity of human beings has expanded with increasing knowledge and education and communication and so on. So in these days we're all people of the two vehicles. So that's even more a reason that the emphasis on intellectuals on one place and ordinary people on another somehow should be overcome. And I believe that can only become overcome by intellectuals themselves. And of course it's true again, isn't it, that the more people who are so-called intellectuals, who are actually practicing this Buddhism, perhaps working in the academic field in some way or another, then inevitably the more they, because they will not look upon themselves as different from everybody else, will spread that feeling outwards to others, and change will be brought about. So you can see it doesn't matter what field of society, in the end, the surest way to bring about this change is the presence, the words, thoughts and actions of people who are practicing to the Gohonzon. Even one person amongst 10, 15 or 20 can begin to change the whole view of life of that particular little group or community. It's an incredible, exciting thing. So Robert will read a passage now, page 77 to 78, which goes back on the subject of specialization and its dangers.
Ikeda, you have brought up a very important point. I think that the closed circles of professional specialists you mention have developed at least partly because of the nature of modern learning, which has become over-specialized as scientific technology has advanced at a rapid pace. Because of their inability to grasp the meaning of such learning, the masses either blindly adulate or harbour animosity against the intellectuals. For their part, the intellectuals tend to look down on the masses, who they feel could not possibly understand them or their activities. Today, as learning reaches higher levels, it tends to become so departmentalised that the uninitiated find it incomprehensible. To solve the difficulty, it is now essential for learning to follow the reverse course. That is, it must become generalised instead of specialised and inclusive instead of divided. The world of learning must de-emphasise the ivory tower attitude and emphasise closeness with the people whom it must serve. Toynbee. I agree emphatically in deploring excessive specialisation. It alienates the specialist and the public, including the intelligent but non-specialised members of the public, from each other. The specialist is tempted to despise non-specialists as laymen. Non-specialists are tempted to write off the specialist as useless to anyone who is outside the specialist's own narrow coterie. I myself think that the non-specialists are right. The specialist gets a distorted view, even in his own special field, if he studies it in isolation from its setting. Specialisation seems to me to be a bad approach for trying to understand and to deal with the modern world, because all peoples, all sides of life and all activities are becoming increasingly interdependent. We are living in a world in which we need a global outlook.
So interesting, that section, Toynbee ends by saying, I believe religion is the field in which the intellectuals and the masses have the best chance of once again finding common ground. So we come back to the Gohonzon. And at this point, perhaps, it's worthwhile mentioning our discussion meetings, which are open to everybody. Not everyone in NSUK, I feel, understands truly the importance or the significance of the discussion meeting. But in fact, a well-run discussion meeting can be a forum in which everybody can take part on an absolutely equal level basis. It doesn't matter whether they're intellectuals, really intellectuals, academics, or dustmen, because what is being discussed is life, isn't it? And the understanding of life, there is equal ignorance, whether it may be in the mind of an intellectual or in the mind of a dustman. So really the discussion meeting is a very significant event. We don't understand this enough. But if you look around the people at discussion meetings, the amazing mixture, this is unprecedented. Where else would you find a group of people getting together and talking so freely and openly in someone's house in that way? There isn't anywhere else you'll find such a thing, with such freedom of speech and such openness and warmth. So let's be proud of our discussion meetings. If we're proud of our discussion meetings, if we realize they're unique, then maybe because of that pride, we'll create better and better discussion meetings. This is our heritage, and we have to make it live forever. And it's a very important heritage, because it's totally, totally unique. So I really feel this, please spread around. Think about it yourselves. Chant about it. You know, we go to them every 2 weeks and sort of take them for granted, and it's sort of automatic. But it shouldn't be, because each week there may be new people from all different fields of society there. So in Oxford, for example, there is a professor there, who of course is an intellectual, who has been going to Oxford meetings, it must be now, for 10 years. He doesn't practice, but he loves to go to the meetings. Now that's an incredible thing, isn't it? And I can think of other people too, who haven't ever practiced for one reason or another, but they believe in our discussion meetings. And so they come to them every week or every fortnight. This is really great. So this professor in Oxford sees something unique in these human gatherings. That's why he comes. So really, discussion meeting is a priceless treasure, and we must make sure the treasure's shining, not getting dusty in a corner. So the authors then finally talk about Buddhism and scientific thinking. I'm not going to dwell on that too much, except to say that of course this is in the end what we're all suffering from. The grip which scientific thinking has taken on all aspects of society, and including its effect on education in terms of specialization, which doesn't need emphasizing anymore. So I'm not a scientist. Who here is a scientist? Okay, right. So in the book, the authors say that this is because of the scientific tendency to categorize various phenomena. And in categorizing them, they don't connect them and their unique function with the unique function of something else. So as I see it, therefore, a scientist would say the cat and the leopard are part of the same family, and they might leave it at that. But of course, someone practicing to the Gohonzon would not be satisfied with just that, would they? They'd be saying to themselves, well, if the cat and the leopard are the same family, why do they behave in such different ways? So to a child, or to me, let alone a child, you know, a leopard is certainly not the same thing as a cat. But that's due to my reaction, isn't it, to the leopard. So because we practice the Gohonzon, we become concerned about the spiritual action and interaction between things. And that the scientist doesn't become involved with. Am I right? Basically, yeah. Yes, that's right, because of categorization. Okay, so this is the big problem. And of course, at the moment, everything is bent towards technological training, technological education. Government invests huge sums of money in it. The future of industry and commerce is considered to be solely dependent on it, and so on. But we can all say to ourselves, you know, that's not so. It's not actually producing great minds or people with broad views of life, is it? We see it in the banks. Cuzzo's furious. There he is, sitting over there. Cuzzo's furious at the moment with Barclays Bank. 3 times they've made the same mistake and have never acknowledged it, because presumably the computer doesn't contain some sort of system of ringing Cuzzo up and saying, very sorry. So everything becoming soulless. But there are managers who will sit there and allow this to happen unless Cuzzo gets furious. No one there has taken the initiative to say, well, this could happen and is happening, therefore we must have some human system which can pick these mistakes out so that we can ring up our clients and say, look, we're terribly sorry. This and this has happened. Please forgive us. But hell take it, there's a manager there. If that manager's got a big enough... I know him quite well, I mustn't slander him. But if he's got a big enough mind, he'll do that, won't he? But he's quite content to just let all these technological processes and the specialists who run them, and presumably this is a system that applies to every Barclays Bank in the whole of Great Britain, he allows it to go on. Not big enough, not caring enough, not human enough, isn't it? That's what it all comes down to. And this is because of specialization. Sorry, going back to it again. In this talk it comes back to specialization. It's a terrible evil. The medical profession is becoming similar. I'm not so sure the few doctors, may not have a little 5 buttons or something or other under the table, and when, you go in, they may look at you and think, yes, category Z. Some sort of inspiration about the right medicine comes to them. But of course not. But I mean, that's the sort of way of things these days, isn't it? Awful. We have to change it. When I was an instructor at the Army Staff College, we were very strict about things. I think I said the other day that I always stand up for the British Army, not because of what they have to do, but I tell you they're a great army, because they care for the people. They really care. That's why it's great. Anyway, when I was at the Army Staff College, one of the things that was constantly rammed down us was that we should never ever mention the word bodies. In other words, if you were planning a move of, say, 4,000 or 5,000 men from one point to another, it's very easy for people to say, words to the effect, well, how many bodies does that mean we've got to move from so-and-so to so-and-so at that particular time? And it's uncanny. Once you start talking about bodies rather than people or human beings, the caring for that, it becomes, the body becomes the cipher. Actually, even at VCG meetings in the early days, I heard people not talking about bodies. I can't remember what word was used, but it was a similar sort of appellation. Once you start talking about that, you forget everything. If you talk about bodies or the equivalent, then you forget about comfort, food, warmth, all these important points. You forget that people have got to stop and go to the loo. All these very important human matters. So, one can make such mistakes. The worst thing I ever did, I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit about myself today, but it just came to my mind that the worst thing I ever did, actually, was I was in an infantry regiment, and I was made motor transport officer. I'd just come back from a veterinary course, actually, at the time, and they made me a motor transport officer. And we had about 120 vehicles, I think. And they gave me the job of getting ahead and choosing a site for the battalion. This was in India, for the battalion to bivouac for the night, you see. So I sent a message back with a map reference, dried riverbed, such and such a map reference, very suitable place, etc., etc., etc. And everyone arrived in due course in the 120 vehicles, and they were parked, and everyone put up their bivouacs and everything in this dried riverbed. And it hadn't rained in that region for, I think the local people said at least 40 years at that time of the year. And about an hour after everybody got in there, I looked up and the skies were getting threatening, and it began to rain, and it rained and it rained. But not only did it rain, but by about 11 o'clock at night there was the most thundering roar, and a great tidal wave came down this river. Incredible. Can you imagine my feelings? But it was because I didn't care enough. I didn't care enough really to check properly about the weather conditions. People said it never rained at that time of the year. But actually it had rained sometimes. 40 years previously it had rained at that time of the year. And if I'd really taken pains and cared, I could have discovered that. Anyway, from then onwards I was named, I dare say if I went back to my old regiment now, someone would mention it, I'm known as Causton of the Creek. Oh, disaster. But it's caring, isn't it? My goodness. Well, anyway, that was where I was taught to care, in the British Army. And I'm grateful to you. So, what we're really saying is that everything depends, doesn't